we have with us today Reason Foundation's very own Corey DeAngelis. Corey, how are you holding up with the quarantine?
Hey Ross, thanks for having me. I'm holding up okay. I've worked from home before this anyway, so it's pretty much the same thing, but the weekends are super boring. There's nothing really to do except for go out for a run. But other than that, there's a lot of time for work, so that's great.
Yeah, exactly right. You can never get sick of work and Twitter and the combination thereof, right?
Yeah, my social isolation and social distancing is amping up my Twitter game, so that's always a plus as well.
Yeah,
As
no,
long as as long as it
that's
doesn't stress you out too much.
that's important. I went on your Twitter feed right before and I saw 5 tweets in the past hour, and I thought, okay, that makes sense. It's a good way to self isolate.
Yeah, I was tweeting a little bit, last night and this morning about how has out it, Germany has made homeschooling legal since 1919 or 1938, depending on who you ask. And I was just wondering what's going on in Germany if homeschooling
Mhm.
is legal and their schools are closed down. I guess they're just not getting an education.
Yeah. Well, I mean that is a great place to start the discussion. What is going on with homeschooling, and how is COVID-19 impacting that? Is it speeding up the shift to homeschooling and virtual education? How does that work?
Yeah, it really depends on who you ask and how you define homeschooling. But when you ask me, I essentially say that COVID-19 has essentially, in a matter of weeks, taken the United States from having a homeschool population of about 3% of the school age population to
Hmm.
nearly 100% of the school age population. That's because, the brick and mortar schools have all essentially closed down in the United States, almost all of them. Um, the latest estimate that I saw from Education Week was 99% of schools. So almost all the schools are closed, the brick and mortar schools at least. And so we've jumped a lot in home education, whether you want to call that homeschooling or not.
Hmm.
The homeschool community will push back and say, well, this is just government schooling at home. It's a little different from, detaching yourself from the government school curriculum and having it parent led and led by the student as well. So I agree with the homeschool community there. But then, there's also virtual charter schooling going on as well that a lot of the homeschool groups will say that's not actually homeschooling. But whatever you want to call it, people are at home being educated at home. Essentially, I think of that as homeschooling. Um, but
Hmm.
again, the homeschool community, I think they're pushing back on this because what we're seeing right now with parents at home is like a lower bound of the true benefits of homeschooling because it's not voluntary right now. It's all just kind of thrown at us all at once, and families are having to adjust all at once. So I can understand why there's pushback from the homeschooling community about whether we should call this homeschooling or not. Um, but yeah, I mean, look, people are being educated at home, and it's a
Hmm.
really tough time. And there are a lot of examples of how people are actually switching to virtual charter schools during this time in various states because these virtual school charter schools are essentially unaffected by the closures because they were already doing things virtually before the school closures. So a lot of
Hmm.
families are switching right now from the brick and mortar government run schools to the charter schools. And we could talk about how some states are actually actively trying to prevent people from being able to do that. And that's really
Sure.
something that's irritated me recently in particular states.
Right. So we see, for example, Oregon. What is happening in
Yeah.
Oregon? Because I'm hearing that there's a lot of pushback to virtual education and embracing innovative models of education there.
Yeah. I mean, in 1922, Oregon pushed to make private schooling in general illegal.
Hmm.
In 1925, the Supreme Court made, overruled that ridiculous law as unconstitutional. But now in 2020, Oregon and I think special interest groups have made it illegal to switch to virtual charter schools. Wall Street Journal just wrote about this a few days ago. I'm not sure if it was the editorial board or not, but really good piece if you want to go check that out. But they quoted one school, one virtual school in Oregon, Oregon Connections Academy, and their leader of their school actually said that already 1,600 students had been blocked who wanted to switch from the brick and mortar government run school to the virtual charter school were not allowed to do it. during the crisis. If the crisis wasn't happening, those 1,600 students would have been able to switch schools. It's just that the government blocked people from leaving the brick and mortar schools. And the reason for that is obvious, right? Because if people are switching out of the government run schools, that harms their monopoly and it harms their
Hmm.
funding. So they don't want people to be able to switch to the other side. So that's just completely ridiculous. I mean, this is a time where families are experiencing huge hardships. You know, they're having financial hardships from a lot of families being out of work or reducing work.
Hmm.
And then you also have financial hardships by having to take on additional childcare costs. And now the government is saying you can't switch to the virtual charter schools, even though the virtual charter schools were ready with open arms to take these students. So
Hmm.
that's one of the biggest, that's one of the worst states right now is Oregon. They're just not letting it happen at all. Pennsylvania is doing something similar. They just passed something unanimously in their state legislature, and the governor signed it into law. But the bill, it allows students to switch from the brick and mortar to the virtual schools in Pennsylvania, but it's not allowing. What the bill does, it doesn't allow the enrollments to count onto that virtual school's enrollment counts. So what that means in practice is that while the virtual charter schools in Pennsylvania can take the kids, they're not going to be compensated for those additional kids. So they can educate them. That's better than Oregon, but the state is financially punishing them for accepting
Hmm.
new students and doing the right thing. So the incentives there are completely backwards. You should be incentivizing schools to help kids during the crisis. You shouldn't be financially harming them by having them take on the additional cost, but then not giving them any of that additional funding, which they would have gotten otherwise.
Sure. And we're
So
talking about state compensation, for example. That's really interesting because states and localities have been asking the federal government for some help to tide over these education systems. And you see in the recently passed and signed into law CARES Act, $30 billion in education stabilization, a dedicated fund for education stabilization. How much of that money do you think is going to go towards enabling virtual learning versus just doubling down on the status quo?
yeah, I mean, it's really hard to tell. What's really good that the Federal Department of Education released was guidance and deregulation of allowing funding to go towards virtual learning and to
Hmm.
allow the individual schools to actually spend the money wisely and to spend it with more autonomy. I like that the federal government did that, but you know, this 30 billion is a lot of money. It's about it's almost half of what the federal government spends in 1 year on education in the states. Federal government spends about $70 billion per year for the K through 12 education system in the United States. So 30 billion, that's on the, you know, it's 40 to 50% of what they spend in 1 year. So it's a large, you know, increase in spending. And you know, who knows what they're going to spend the money on. I mean, if you look at trends in the United States about, you know, what schools actually spend money on when they get increases in funding, usually doesn't go to teacher salaries, usually doesn't go to the classroom, it usually goes towards administrative bloat, slip and slides, bigger football stadiums, and it
Hmm.
usually goes to support staff. And so you know, what we've seen in the U.S. If you look at Ben Scaffidy's research, he took the, you know, federal database National Center for Education Statistics, and he reported that between 1992 and 2014, there was about a 30% increase in real education spending in the United States per pupil, but only a 2% or a 2% decrease in real teacher salaries. So all the money was going towards additional support staff, administrative bloat. And I think it's because, you know, there's a lot of monopoly power in the current traditional public school system in the United States. If you don't have to spend the money wisely, if you don't have to spend the money on your customers, what is your, you know, your incentive to do so? And I think that's why we see, you know, large amounts of administrative bloat and staffing surges in the United States.
Hmm.
Hey, who knows? You know, maybe they'll do something different this time because it's a, you know, a different
Could be,
time.
could be.
You know, maybe they'll
Yeah.
spend it towards technology this time. It's just it's hard to tell at this point. You know, I don't want to, you know, predict what they're actually going to do with the money. But if history tells us anything, it tells us that they're not going to spend the money wisely. And even if they have, you know, good intentions to spend this money wisely, they may not even know what to spend the money on without those competitive pressures, without people voting with their feet.
Sure.
Um, I will say, if we had school choice in place, and if we allowed families to actually switch to these virtual schools, or use a voucher to go to a private school, I think this money would be spent more wisely, because then the government schools could sit there and think, and the leaders of these schools can sit there and think, well, if we don't respond to the crisis well, we're going to lose customers. And if we don't spend this money well, we're not going to remain competitive. And then, people may switch to a private school using a voucher next year. So if we had universal school choice within a particular state or area, I think that would give you a way stronger incentive to respond correctly.
Sure, and there is that hope, but I think it goes back to a phrase you uttered not one, but two times. And this really, I see this again and again, my time in the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Who knows? That's all you can ask when it comes to federal, state, and local actions. So to keep monitoring, to keep tabs on the situation, where can we go to read more of your work?
As I alluded to earlier, just go to my Twitter. It's at DeAngelis Corey. It's my last name and first name. But really, I do a lot of work on Twitter, and I share a lot of my articles. And like, I'll share this interview that we're doing today on Twitter.
Excellent.
But then also you can go to my Reason Foundation website. Just go to reason.org, or you can just Google Corey DeAngelis Reason, and you'll find a lot of my work there as well.
All right, and you can see some of our work at TPA at protectingtaxpayers.org. Well, thank you so much, Corey. We'll have to see what the governments continue to do to respond to some of these crazy times, some of these unprecedented challenges, and no matter what, it's going to be a wild ride. Stay tuned. Thanks.
Thanks, Ross.